Dr. Claire Hubbard-Hall has broken the code on how to uncover and report on the remarkable history of women who have silently served British intelligence over the years. In her book, Secret Servants of the Crown, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence, which will be published in the U.S. on February 25th, she shares previously untold tales about the women who largely worked in the shadows in British intelligence. We'll ask her about how she managed to obtain some fascinating stories that have remained hidden in British intelligence archives, and to give us a glimpse of some of those tales, including the story of Kathleen Pettigrew, the woman who has inspired Ian Fleming's Miss Moneypenny in the James Bond novels. Dr. Claire Hubbard-Hall, welcome to the Cipher Briefs Cover Stories podcast.
Thanks, I'm looking forward to chatting.
Well, we appreciate your joining us today to talk about your new book, Secret Servants of the Crown, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence. And your book covers a long and largely hidden history of going back to before World War I of women in British intelligence. But before we dive into that, I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about your history and how you became a specialist in spy history.
Okay, it's a great starting point. So I didn't originally start out as a historian working on women's history. My PhD was actually on Nazi Germany, the Gestapo spy network. So I started on looking at the bad guys rather than the good guys. And that was my PhD done and dusted. I got married, had a daughter, and suddenly realised I couldn't go jet-setting around the world to all the wonderful archives that I used to visit. So I had to sort of change focus and explore British intelligence history. And somebody gifted me, at my former university where I worked, gifted me a copy of Stella Rimington's memoir, Open Secret. And I read that from the front to the back. I absolutely devoured every page. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. She's so honest, so candid about the challenges that she faced on her journey to the top as the first female Director General of Britain's Security Service. And at the end of it, I was left with one massive question. Where was the history of women in British intelligence? I just couldn't find it. I could find mentions of certain women here and there in various histories and narratives, but there wasn't an overarching history of their contribution, their roles, and who they were, basically. So I decided that I would make that my mission, to write them into the narrative of British intelligence history. And the product that we have is Secret Servants of the Crown. But that's just step one, because obviously there's a huge number of other women that aren't within this book. So hopefully their stories will be told in future books.
And we should point out that your book was published in the UK a couple months ago under a slightly different title of Her Secret Service. So for our listeners overseas, not in the US, they might want to look for the book under that name. Given the nature of the topic that we delve into, we're always interested in sources and methods. And I understand that digging up info about women in British intelligence was particularly challenging. I wonder if you could tell us how you went about researching this book.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why they have remained forgotten for so long, is because it's taken a long time. It's almost sort of excavating them from the coalface. They're not easy to get at, whereas men, dare I say it, are slightly easier to research within the secret services, because they were the ones that made the decisions. So when you go to the archives and you look at organisational records, the men are there present, very visible, whereas the women are the ones that created the documents. They sat at the typewriters. They curated the paperwork in the files. They organised it. They archived it. So you have to kind of get at their presence slightly different. So it required a lot of sort of thinking outside the box. And if I'm honest, in the book, I liken it to being kind of a counterintelligence officer, because you start off with literally fragments of evidence, which, most historians might look at it and think, good God, can't do anything with that. However, if you collect enough of these fragments and like a counterintelligence officer build the picture up in any direction, following every kind of line of inquiry, you can start to build that narrative, that biography of that individual. And if you do it long enough for a number of individuals, you then start to see the connections between them. And you realise that the world back then, in pre-1945 Britain, as probably the rest of the world was a lot smaller in terms of social circles. And you start to see that these women are the daughters, the nieces, they're working alongside their probably 5 other female cousins in their family, in the registry of MI5. So you start to see patterns as a counterintelligence officer does, but that takes time. And the book probably took me in total probably about 10 years. Wow. From beginning to end of rooting out as much information as I possibly could. But the other thing that is quite time consuming when it comes to women in intelligence is tracking down family relatives, because that's really where the gems lie. Looking, hoping, praying that there are some private collections held within families that have never been looked at before. So I managed to do a lot of what a family historian would do, genealogy, tracking down living relatives, which is quite difficult for some of the women, especially the MI6 women who never married and never had children. You then have to go down siblings lines. And again, that can become quite tricky in terms of trying to find living relatives. But I struck gold. It was almost as if the timing was perfect and they were just waiting to be contacted and found. So that's sort of a little insight into my methodology of tackling this subject.
Yeah, I was surprised to read in your book that as late as 1972, women in MI6 weren't permitted to marry. So that obviously added to your burden of trying to track down family members from some of the early MI6 women. Do you think that women were also more vigilant about observing the Official Secrets Act and were less likely to write memoirs or fictionalized accounts of what they did, which added to your burden?
I think so, and I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think they were slightly better at keeping their mouths shut and keeping, having signed the Official Secrets Act, they really did stick to it, unlike some male officers who couldn't wait to blab after both wars had ended, or make their money with their memoirs, usually published in the States first because they weren't permitted to in Britain. So a lot of the early memoirs are printed by American publishers to kind of get round that prosecution in British courts.
Wow.
So I think women were, dare I say, better at keeping secrets than men. A proportion of men, shall we say, at that time.
Throughout much of the early years that you read about, the main, perhaps the only entryway for women was clerical roles. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about the types of women who joined the intelligence services and what they were asked to do in those early years.
Yeah, so the entry point for most women going into MI5, MI6 or the wartime services was the clerical route. And it was from that point, if they had a particular number of languages or they proved themselves in a particular area, that they then might progress into different areas. But the typewriter and the professional routes that were open to the women at the start of the 20th century really was kind of the opening door for women going into the intelligence services, just like lots of other professions at the time. Women were stepping forward into those clerical roles of stenography, typists, to follow, working on the telephones, working as messengers. They were performing these roles. But of course, that sort of talks to the professional class of women who might have been upper working class or middle class that sought this sort of financial independence for themselves. Within the intelligence services, you have that broad spectrum of women coming from lots of different social classes. So you have the debutantes as well at the other end of the broad spectrum. You know, the women who were taught how to hold a champagne glass as opposed to type in the first instance, but they would have gone to finishing school. They would have spoken French, perhaps a number of other languages as well. And of course, their fathers or their uncles or their grandfathers probably worked already in the intelligence services. So there was that extension of trust. Before professional vetting of individuals, it was done through, well, you know, they're a family member, I can vouch for them. There was that extension of trust. So a number of, I guess what you call upper class social gals were also employed in the intelligence services until they married, of course, and then they left.
One of the really interesting things that you read about was the registry, which was a way of keeping track of potential threats. And long before the invention of the computer, there was this massive card file. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how that worked.
Yeah, this is mind-blowing almost. We use computers now to solve problems for us and store information. And a lot of how we store information on the computer, as in files and folders and tabs, these are all things that sort of hark back to this sort of bureaucratic culture, office culture that no longer exists. So you would have these really tall cabinets, card index file systems with lots of little drawers containing hundreds of paper cards that are storing some kind of information. And of course, there are lots of these cabinets that are housed in almost kind of like a warehouse style room. If you think of, not on the scale of Indiana Jones, where you see all the treasures disappearing into the warehouse, but if you think just on that massive scale of the storage and processing of information that the counterintelligence officers are calling upon to basically find individuals or keep tabs on where they're going. And of course, this is the result of female power. All these organisational skills that they've brought in, that's what makes the registry function so well. But you would have cards for enemies, and those enemies would be graded in terms of priority. You might have a persons of interest card file index. You may have a card index file system for postal communications, radio messages. I mean, the list goes on. And these women were able to pull quite easily. They would have to wear flat shoes because you wouldn't want to wear heels running around in this kind of work. So you had to be fit. You had to be willing to go up ladders and down ladders with some ease, and you would be spending 7-hour shifts doing this. So it really was a physical job to do, while maintaining perfect hair and makeup as well at the same time. But yeah, I mean, the registry was, in the book I call it one of the wonders of the secret world. I've no idea what the other ones are. I'll let somebody else come up with what they may be. But the registry is certainly up there in the list of one of those wonders of the secret world.
Really is mind-boggling, the task that involved in doing all that. Yeah, there are a lot of fascinating women in the book, but perhaps the most intriguing is Kathleen Pettigrew, whose long career seems to have touched some of the most iconic moments. She seems to have had association with Mata Hari and Ian Fleming and even Kim Philby. And she, as you read about, was the model for Miss Moneypenny. I wonder if you could touch on her long career and what you found out about her.
Yes, so she was the first woman that I began with when I started researching this book, and this book almost didn't get written because she was the first woman and she was so hard to research. I mean, it was like, in the book I call it trying to summon a ghost. It was almost impossible, and it took years to get at her, but I eventually did. And as you read the book, by the time you get to the end, if I've done my work correctly enough, you won't really be any closer to thinking that you know Kathleen, because her tradecraft was so brilliant. But she is the opposite to the Miss Moneypenny character we see depicted on the screen, of being sort of a debutante. She's, pictured or filmed with her pearls, her hair pristine in place, and being, the inference is that she's upper class, she's well spoken, etc. Well, Kathleen Pettigrew was from a working class background. Her grandfather was an East Londoner. He had been sent to prison, received several strokes of the whip for stealing items. A real kind of London geezer. So Kathleen Pettigrew's father worked as, I guess the equivalent would be, he basically took skins of seals and processed them, and various other animals, so that they could be made into luxury items of clothing at the turn of the 20th century. It wasn't a very pleasant job, as you can imagine. The carcasses came in on barges, went into factories to be processed, so that the fumes from the factories and the waste going back into the canals was pretty toxic, and no doubt contributed to his early death, leaving the Pettigrew family, the Pettigrew women, Kathleen and her older sister, who worked in Special Branch for the London Metropolitan Police, and her mother, who worked running the grocery store in George Court, which is off the Strand in London, which has lots of the theatres on the Strand. So Kathleen she was schooled like most children, but her parents made the decision that her and her sister should try and have the best education that they could that was available to them. So they went to a charitable school, which was slightly better than some of the other schools that were available, and she was taught French as a language alongside the academic subjects, as well as cookery, of course, what all girls were taught. And it was from there that she most likely went to a secretarial training college that was incredibly close to where they lived on George Court. And it was also incredibly close to Special Branch. So when you look at the area of where they were living, it's no doubt that she will have gone there. And that secretarial college was quite famous at the time, Pitman's. It's still around today. And they famously supplied women to government departments and things like Special Branch. So Kathleen followed her older sister into Special Branch, but found herself working as an assistant, a secretary to a chap called Basil Thompson, who headed a Special Branch during the First World War. And this is where Kathleen came to be sitting in a room with Mata Hari, most likely, when she was being interrogated. And Kathleen's career, I guess, is really a fantastic example of showing how individuals within the secret intelligence world are so connected to key events throughout the 20th century. In some capacity, there is always some link in terms of how the machinery of intelligence works. And you can chart right from Mata Hari through to the 1950s, when Kathleen retires, when those storm clouds are forming over MI6 after the defection of Burgess and Maclean, and then suspicion is being thrown on Philby, who is asked to leave MI6 but eventually comes back later on. So she is this walking, talking history book for MI6. And after her career, she's had enough of London. She wants to leave the big smoke, and she makes her way to Devon, a beautiful coastal village called Sidmouth. which has its origins in the Georgian period. So it have these lovely sort of winding paths down to the beachfront, and she lives in a flat overlooking the seafront, and she moves around. But for the 30 years that she's in retirement in Sidmouth, which isn't near a railway station, the nearest railway station is half an hour away, so you have to get a car, a taxi or a bus to get to Sidmouth, so it's quite remote. So for 30 years she lives in retirement, and she doesn't leave one fingerprint. She doesn't go to bingo, she doesn't play bowls, literally nothing, which is quite remarkable, and again I guess speaks to her awareness of her former position and using her training, I guess. But she did leave, I did manage to find a living relative, the only Pettigrew who is living, who met Kathleen Pettigrew, and that is one of her second cousins. And he had a letter that Kathleen had written to his father in the 70s, and that's the only document that we have of her voice. I've managed to find files that have got through the weeding process in the National Archives, because they shouldn't be there because they're MI6 files within other files. So you see her signature on certain reports. I found memos, little chits in files that are paper clipped in, that she's clearly handled. And then obviously within those files there's a whole bunch of A4 white pieces of paper that the archive staff have put there saying that there is a file here, but you can't look at it. So which relates to the MI6 reports. So she was a key person. I don't think we'll ever know the true contribution that she made unless MI6 release any of their files, but that doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. But she clearly played a critical point, especially contribution during the Second World War, where everything crossed her desk, including Ultra and Enigma decrypts that were coming out of Bletchley Park past her desk to go to sea, and then they would decide which services that they would serve best, and they would disseminate them. So just that in itself gives you a sense of a key role that she's playing. And you see her signature, and I'm sure at some point she must have signed for C himself to try and quicken up processes. That's just my intuition of reading the material.
C being the head of MI6.
Yes.
And she served a number of Cs.
She did, yeah. So she served from the first C, Mansfield Cumming, then Hugh Sinclair, then Stuart Mingus during World War II, and then two other heads of C before she retired.
Wow.
So
and during the World War II period is when she ran across Ian Fleming, who was working for Naval Intelligence, and so all the signs point to her being the model for Miss Moneypenny in the James Bond novel.
Absolutely. And the first draft of Casino Royale that Ian Fleming wrote, the first Bond novel, Miss Moneypenny was not called Miss Moneypenny. She was originally called Miss Pettigrew. And Ian's brother Peter, who also worked in British intelligence during the war, said, "Hang on, Ian, this is a bit too close. You need to change the name." So he crossed out Miss Pettigrew, and Miss Moneypenny was born. So it's the likelihood, Pettigrew, I mean, they're incredibly close. And he would have gone into her antechamber outside of C's office during World War II to meet Stuart Mingus for several meetings, many throughout the war. So he will have seen and probably spoken with Kathleen. I doubt that he would have thrown his trilby on the hat stand like Ian Fleming and she would have floated across to get it for him. I don't think that would have happened at all.
You mentioned Bletchley Park, and I wanted to get to that too because there's tremendous intelligence work done there, and I was surprised by the enormous number of women who worked there, and the vast majority of the people who did all the terrific work there in code breaking, code making, and things like that were women. I wonder if you could touch on that just a bit.
Yes, so Bletchley Park, the mecca for all spy historians and spy enthusiasts. It's the centre, the brain of British intelligence. It's connecting everything, human intelligence. Everything is all connected to the ability to read the enemy's messages and know what they're thinking and know if our deception or misinformation that we're feeding them is working for things like double cross. And 75% of the workforce at Bletchley Park is women. So by the end of the war, there's about 10,000 people on site, and 75% of them are women, which is an incredible figure saying out loud, and really kind of drums home the vital contribution that women made in code breaking. And there were very, very few female actual code breakers or cryptanalysts. There were some key women working with people like Dilly Knox, etc. But the large part of these women are doing very mundane work, and they've got no idea what their specific task, whether it's translating the original German or Japanese, depending on what they're working on. They've got no idea if they're in charge of looking for particular patterns with numbers that they don't really understand, but they've become familiar with. They're looking for weather signs. They're all working very, very distinctively, and they've no idea how their work is feeding in to the overall picture. And of course, that's to protect the work that's going on at Bletchley Park. So it's phenomenal. You've got the cleaners that come in first thing in the morning. You can imagine Alan Turing and his team rolling up maps with particular pinpoints in because they were told to. The cleaners couldn't see exactly what they were working on. So ship movements, submarines, formations, etc. over the Atlantic, all those maps had to be whipped up and hidden, rolled up before the cleaners came in. But cleaners are important. In the book, I say from cleaner to codebreaker, again, sort of breaking this this idea that it is only a certain amount of people that have an effect, have agency. Because if you have a dirty work environment, you're not going to have a very productive team. So everything within intelligence is teamwork. And however small, however large, it all feeds in to the end result.
One of the other things that's interesting in your book is you don't just write about the women who are employed as officers or clerical staff at MI5 or MI6, but also some of the women who were assets or agents working for them. And one particular notable one is Olga Gray. I wonder if you could tell just a little bit of her story.
Yeah, Olga Gray, she deserves to be known as one of MI5's greatest undercover operatives in its entire history. Unfortunately, her handler gets all the glory, Maxwell Knight, as being he gets the attribute of the greatest spy master, but actually it's Olga. It's Olga that's doing all the work. She was not a trained MI5 agent that was given this job, which was essentially to work undercover. She worked undercover for a period of 6 years in the British Communist Party in London, trying to find out information that the British Communist Party was engaged in espionage. The British government wanted to know if they could make the link back to the Kremlin. And Olga was working as a secretary at the British Communist Party headquarters in London. And over a 6-year period, she eventually led to the uncovering of the Woolwich Arsenal spy ring, which were a number of key individuals that were smuggling out military blueprints of weapons, and then passing them back to the Russians. So it took 6 years of working undercover, which is a phenomenal amount of time. And she did that having very little training on how to survive and operate undercover, because she'd only ever been originally a secretary. But Maxwell Knight had a very risky strategy, which paid off for him, of employing women who had worked as secretaries in the hope that, and then inserting them into various undercover positions in the hope that, a bit like when a cuckoo lays its egg in a nest, hoping that one of them would hatch and have success for him. And Olga did. But she bore a great price at that. Halfway through her 6-year stint, she actually had a breakdown because the toll of working undercover just took too much from her. But Maxwell Knight managed to convince her eventually to come back. And then with a series of other events with the other individuals that she was working with very closely in the British Communist Party and were also engaged in espionage, that events unfolded very quickly and they were able to uncover the spy ring.
And she ended up testifying in court trials and things like that.
She did.
Under a pseudonym or...
Yep, she did. So she was known as Miss X when she supplied evidence to protect her identity. However, unfortunately, the press got wind of who actually she was, her real identity, and that caused MI5 to wash their hands of her. So rather than looking after her, after the court case had finished and the Russian agents had been prosecuted and sentenced to prison, unfortunately Maxwell Knight sent an unnamed colonel to take Olga for a very nice dinner in the Ritz, handed her over some money, and then basically said, "You're on your own," which is an incredible, and no idea of duty of care, no idea or forward thinking that this could be a woman who could be helped to train up other women going into these roles, and she was just cast out. So she spent the rest, she drove an ambulance during when war broke out. She drove an ambulance, met a Canadian and had a happy ending-ish, moved over to Canada, but she spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder constantly, worrying, because Russians have long memories.
They do indeed.
Mm-hmm.
Let me indulge you and ask you one last story that I found really interesting in the book, and that's about two women, Rita and Enya. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Ina, who were working for MI6 and as the war was breaking out and had to escape from Geneva to get back to the UK and crossed Europe in part on bicycle to escape the approaching German army. Tell us just a little bit about their story.
Okay, these are two fantastic women who I could see if a film was being made. Their whole entire life story just jumps out. You can see it already happening in front of you. But yeah, they are two... Again, these are individuals who have remained off the radar. I think Rita has perhaps been more visible than Ina, but they had a friendship that since the late 1930s, they became great friends. And I think that friendship, if I had to pinpoint it, began when both of them were posted in Switzerland before the war, and then when France fell in 1940 and the German army started to make its way down to the south of France, coming very close to the Swiss border, and the British were worried that Switzerland, even though it was neutral, might be invaded. So they ordered all their MI6 staff at their stations to evacuate. And Ina and a number of other women were at Geneva, and Rita was asked to go from her station, I can't remember off the top of my head which city it was, but it was on the other side of Switzerland. And she was asked to go and basically escort Ina and these other women who, in my mind, were not perhaps operational. They were women who sat in the back rooms and did the paperwork at the MI6 station. I don't think they'd ever had any kind of operational training, field training, whereas Rita had. So Rita had been asked to basically meet them in Geneva at the train station and then accompany them across France to try and get on a boat and get back to Britain. Now, within the book, I recount their journey, which is absolutely hair-raising at certain points. They make their way on the train to start with, but then everybody gets kicked off because the trains are only for the military then. So then they hitch rides in lorries, vans, sometimes hanging on to the side of vans, which is quite incredible, really. And then bicycles, which on roads which are very stony, and not made for bicycles, is a particularly arduous task to cycle on, because they don't have modern mountain bikes that are equipped for all terrain. They've just got very sort of rudimentary bicycles with thin tyres. And of course Rita has never ridden a bicycle at all, so that that poses some problems to start with.
Can be a drawback, yeah.
Yes, yeah. She ends up with quite a few bruises after coming off. But they, over a period of sort of 9 days, trek all the way across France. And Ina recorded this in a very sort of out-of-character document, which I think was instigated by Rita's death many decades after the war, which obviously shook her very, very much. They were incredibly close, unsure as to the exact nature of their relationship, but there was a very, very close relationship there in terms of friendship. And Ina, obviously, when you get to a certain age, you start to look back more than you do you focus on looking forward, you turn to your memories. And this obviously was a key point, which is why I think this is where they met, that this journey was that sort of starting point of that relationship for the rest of their lives, of which they stayed together as a duo. And she wrote this account of the journey, which she left with a friend in the event that she died. And when I tracked down the friends that knew Ina and Rita, they disclosed this document and a whole host of other things as well. So that was why I was able to recount this wonderful journey across, because it's actually Ina that had recorded it, which is out of character because there's MI6 women, but again there are no national secrets divulged in this document. Right. It very much is a description of the journey, losing 2 of their friends, the friendship of the French people who stored their luggage when they got to a certain point, about a third of the way in. They couldn't be dragging 10 suitcases with them, so they left them with this French woman in her barn, and the woman stoically said, I'll keep them safe until when the war ends, whenever that might be. And the great thing is, Rita went back when the war ended and got the suitcases, which is fantastic, and they were still there in the barn. But they are two very remarkable women in the sense of thinking MI6 as this wonderful kind of travel agency, of travelling the world within MI6. Because they really did. And after they had made it back to Britain, Ina spent a short period of time at Bletchley Park. She was a German specialist, and she was actually working with the other MI6 women on the first floor of the mansion at Bletchley Park, before she then went with Rita to set up the Lisbon MI6 office, where they spent the rest of the war. And then maintained a home there just on the outskirts of Lisbon after the war had ended, right up until their deaths, as well as having homes in Britain. And their time in Lisbon, you get hints, just like with Kathleen Pettigrew, some of those key moments, those key individuals, they're there. And Rita is the ultimate quartermaster in terms of organising travel for agents, for defectors, for intelligence officers, probably Fleming himself, all the flights, etc. I mean, it was fantastic. And she took that knowledge. Ina was working with her on it. She took that knowledge at the end of the war, and this is when it gets really interesting. At the end of the war, she leaves MI6 along with Ina, and she sets up International Services, which is a high-end travel agency. But this travel agency doesn't go to typical holiday resorts in Mallorca, Spain, etc. They're going to really remote places like Russia, China, South America, Afghanistan, and they're taking little groups of posh, retired individuals and offering them special introductions to certain key foreign individuals within those countries and also within the British embassies that are located in those countries. And I will never be able to prove it, but I'm pretty sure that that was an MI6 cover. And you can read in the book my reasoning for that, because I did find some paperwork about a plan that MI6 was cooking up just before the war had ended, about setting up travel agencies and having their MI6 officers using them as cover, as opposed to their original role that they'd been using as cover within embassies of passport control officers. And within the document, the document,
it sounds like a cover operation to
absolutely.
me.
And within the document, it says women are the preferred gender because their camouflage is perfect. So, in middle-aged women, Rita and Ina, stampeding across all these places, and I think they were the first travel agency to go into China when China opened up for tourists to go in. So, yeah, you can read all about that in the book, but that gives you a kind of a flavour of their fascinating careers.
Indeed it is. It's just one of the many fascinating stories in the book, which is very well written and entertaining, despite the fact that you're a doctor. It's not so much an academic book as a spy novel, but nonfiction. And again, the title of the book is Secret Servants of the Crown, The Forgotten Women of British Intelligence. We highly recommend it, and we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.